Hey, what's happening? I just got done doing a pretty big project on my house. It took me a lot of weekends to get done, a lot of manual labor, but the end result was pretty awesome. And that was to put LEDs on my house, right? Like the permanent LED holiday lights. So I never have to put Christmas lights up on the eaves of my house again. They're just there year round. So when you do that, you obviously want to put up something that aesthetically looks good, and also something that you can program to do all kinds of different holidays and colors and all that stuff. So I did a lot of research on YouTube. I found some videos that covered some of the points pretty well, some of them that glossed over the stuff I was really looking for. There's a lot of great videos on how to configure the software and install it on the controller and all that stuff. I'm not going into all that because there's plenty of good videos on that. I'm going to talk a lot more about the installation and how I wired it and all that stuff. Let's get into the first topic, and this is going to be pixel strands versus pixel strips and why you might pick one versus the other. It really depends on the effect you're looking for. One effect is to have every pixel or LED be visible, like from the sidewalk or from the front of your house or wherever people are going to see the lights. And if you want to do a lot of cool light effects, I think it's better to be able to see each individual pixel. The other idea would be to have indirect lighting, like say coming off of your eaves and backlighting the house itself. And that's more of a glow, kind of indirect lighting effect. If you want every individual pixel to be seen, because you're looking for more of a visual effect from the street, which is what I was looking for, then I think doing pixel strands or strings is the way to go. So these are what I decided ultimately to use. These are WS2811 pixel strings. You can get them on Amazon, you can get them on AliExpress. I'll put a link to the ones I bought. They're pretty affordable. They're waterproof. Every single one of these, I don't know if you could see in there, but every single one of these has a little computer chip in it. And so these are what is called individually addressable, meaning the controller can tell every single pixel what to do. Now, I picked these ones again because I wanted, once they were installed, I wanted the tip of these lights to be visible from the sidewalk or the street. But I didn't want them sticking out so far that, you know, it looked bad when they were turned off or during the day. So now the next thing I had to figure out, and this was probably one of the biggest challenges of my project, was how do I mount these on my house and have it still look aesthetically pleasing or not look bad. And on top of that, how can I do that in a way that's not super expensive? So here's what I ended up coming up with. Now, there's a few, I shouldn't even say a few. There's some products available online to mount these lights into a channel that then mounts to your house. What I've found is that the cost of that pre-drilled channel that these lights can snap into, the cost of that pre-drilled channel was going to cost way more than the rest of my project combined. And I didn't want to spend that much money to do this project. So I made my own channel. Here's what I came up with. This is just a piece of vinyl, and I made the channel by starting with a piece of vinyl gutter downspout. Okay, so it was a rectangular shaped piece. They come in 10-foot lengths. They cost about $12 at Home Depot, and they come in white. And they're not drilled out, so none of these holes are there. It's just a solid piece of vinyl. And it has like these kind of like ribs down the side. It's your traditional gutter downspout. So what I did with these was, first I had to measure and drill out every one of these holes. And you have to get the holes a very specific size so that these little LEDs, these pixels, will snap into place. And I found, so if I just shove it through, they kind of like lock into place, and now that one's fixed there, right? So that's what it looks like on the back side. The size of the hole is technically, I think, supposed to be 12 millimeters. It's a metric size, but I didn't have a metric bit. So what I ended up using was a standard size step down bit, and I discovered that the proper hole size for these pixels is 15/32 of an inch. If you go to 1/2 inch, they're going to wiggle and be loose. They won't fit tight. And if you go any smaller, they're not going to fit at all. So 15/32 is the perfect size for these pixels to just snap right into place and stay in place. They're very secure once they're in there. So 15/32 hole. Now the next thing you have to know is how far apart to space these for your string or strand of lights. I went with 2 3/4 inches on center. You could go a touch smaller than that, but I would not go any bigger than that. I would not do 3 inches. If you do, you're going to be really stretching these wires apart, and I think you're going to risk severing one of the electrical connections at where these pixels are. So if you do 2 3/4 between each hole, in one 10-foot length, I was able to get 43 pixels per. So what I ended up doing was my starting hole, I always started at 1/2 of this distance. And I did that so that when I put 2 pieces end to end together, it would end up at 2 3/4. So from the end to my first hole, I always did at 1 3/8. So 1 3/8, start the first one, and then 2 3/4 all the way to the end. You'll fit 43 of these in one of these 10-foot lengths, and then at the end, I would measure 1 3/4 or 1 3/8 off of that one, and usually cut that at the end, unless I was doing corners where I would put 45s and stuff. So I'm going to show you what these look like mounted on the house. I'm going to show you how I mounted them, and I'm also going to show you how I ultimately drilled these out and built these. And I have 884 pixels on my house, so I had to make a bunch of these, and it was pretty time consuming. Before I show it on the house itself, I'm going to show you the mounting method. So on here, I have some holes that I've drilled through. Hopefully you can see those holes here and here that drill through this way. And then what I've done is I've taken and I've made a whole bunch of these spacers. These are just pieces of PEX tubing. You can get a 5-foot length of this at Home Depot for a couple bucks. So I cut these into like 2-inch lengths so that they fit in between these sides of this channel, like so. So I line those up where the holes are that go side to side. I have it go over the top of my wiring, and then I have a screw. This one is 2 3/4 inch. I think a 3-inch would work fine in this case. And I basically have that screw go all the way through like that. So that's the part that's going to mount it to the back of my fascia. So let's pretend that this board is my fascia board and that this side is the back of the fascia. I would mount them like so. So that that's just about even with the bottom of the fascia, but that the LEDs, if we were going to look from the front of the fascia, the LEDs should stick down just past so that they're just visible. Okay? So that's ultimately the install process. I mounted about every 18 to 20 inches or so. You could get away with about every 2 feet. The thing that I was careful to do was to make sure that any mounting hole that I drilled across was not directly in line with one of the pixels, right? So they're always in between so that it didn't interfere with the pixels themselves. So here's what it looks like mounted on the back of the fascia itself. You can see I just get the bottom of the channel about even with the fascia, and then you can see those spacers and screws going across, and then the pixel strands, and then there's my power injection wire, which I'll get to in just a little bit. But that's what it looks like on the back of the fascia, and you can see those little pixels are sticking down just a little bit below, and yeah, overall pretty easy to mount. So every time I came up to a corner, I just cut a 45 with my miter saw, which was pretty easy to do. And then when you get to the end, as I mentioned earlier, I do 1 3/8 from the last pixel on each piece, and then I start the new one at 1 3/8 so that they're evenly spaced apart, where you have two pieces that butt together. All right, the process of building the channels starts by measuring, and starting with my first hole, I went 1 3/8, and then I cut this block to exactly 2 3/4, and I just used that block to measure my spacing. Then I took one of them and just used it as a template and just put marks across all of the others. So this is how I knew how far apart to do my holes. Now I started by doing a pilot hole. So I just used a small bit and just did a pilot hole on every one of those marks. And I already had my drill press set so that those holes were perfectly on center. And then I went back with my step bit, going to the exact depth I needed to achieve that 15 30-second hole size, and making sure that those are all done clean. A step bit works really well for this. And then I put the channels on sideways so I could do my mounting holes, and I just made sure those were big enough for the screw to fit through, and those go all the way through both sides of the channel. Now once I had all of my holes drilled and done, I just ripped all of these in half on a table saw. Table saw is a little bit messy, but it is pretty effective and works. So you end up with all of these half channels. And then I painted them to match the underside of my eaves so that they would blend into the house a lot better. Okay, we're going to start talking about the wiring for all of these. I'm not going to go into how I built my LED controller and stuff, but we're going to start from the LED controller and we're going to work our way out to the pixels. The one thing I want to tell you, and this is really important, test all of your strands before you actually mount them to the house.
I'm sorry, can you repeat that?
Test all of your strands before you actually mount them to the house. This is one big mistake I made where I started just mounting them to the house, and I actually ended up with a bad strand that was preventing an entire section from ever lighting up. And it took me quite a while to troubleshoot. So do yourself a favor. Take one of your strands, put some little pigtails off of them, and then hook them into your LED controller and actually make sure they light up, and plug additional strands into that strand to make sure the ones you are about to mount on the house are actually functional before you install them. You're going to save yourself a ton of headache. So test, test, test before you actually install. When it comes to hooking the two strands together, they come with these connectors, but those aren't necessarily waterproof, so I wanted to replace them. So what I would do is plug them together first. That way I made sure I had the wires in the proper order, and then I would just cut the connectors out, and then I would strip the wires back and use these solder butt connectors with the heat shrink built in, and I would just use a lighter and a combination of a lighter and a heat gun in order to do these connections. And that way I could ensure that all of these were totally waterproof when I was done. So again, after I'd tested all of the strands, this is how I hooked each strand together. I just used some simple inline connectors for my power injection that are going to tap into my power injection line, and I did that at the end of each strand. Okay, here's the overall wiring diagram. I have 3 main roof lines that I'm dealing with. Roof line 1, 2, and 3. The first one is 202 pixels. The next one is about 520 pixels or so. And then the last one is about 160 or so pixels. So let's take a look at how I wired in the first segment coming off of LED 1. So from LED 1 out to my first segment of pixels, I have about a 25-foot 18 gauge 3-wire run. So that's just a positive, a negative, and then yellow is the data wire. So I have the data wire feeding in there. Now in parallel to that, I have a separate, off of a different fuse, power injection line running in parallel. That is also 18 gauge and it's a 2-wire. And I'm simply tapping into that continuous strand at the end of every one of my sections of pixels or strands of pixels. So my first segment, roofline 1, has 3 separate power injection points as well as the power coming in at the beginning of that entire roof line. Now as I leave roofline 1 and head over to roofline 2, I have about a 12-foot jumper in between those 2 segments. And I'm using more of that 18 gauge 3-wire to make that connection. Now, before I start roofline 2, I'm bringing in a fresh power injection line. That's the 18 gauge 2-wire. So it comes straight off of a new fuse and another ground off of the controller board, and it heads over and starts injecting power on roofline 2. So roofline 2 picks up at the end of where roofline 1 left off. Again, this is all coming off of LED 1, but the fresh power injection starts at the end of the first segment on roofline 2. And I have about 10 strands linked together, so I have about 10 separate power injections all along there. And that keeps the lighting consistently bright end to end on that entire roofline 2 segment. And then for my last segment, which is my upper roofline, roofline 3, I decided to come off of the controller directly because it was a lot closer to the controller. So I just came off of the second LED output. That Dig quad board has 4 LED outputs. I'm only using LED 1 and LED 2 for this project. But I'm coming off that the same as I did roofline 1. I have a 3-wire 18 gauge line feeding that segment and then a separate power injection line coming off of there. Now at the end, I have a future project that I want to do for some Halloween lights up inside the vent of my attic. And so I just ran some extra 3-wire in there so I can add a few more pixels onto the end of that later. So I'll end up with what would technically be roofline 4. But that in a nutshell is how I wired this entire project. All right, last thing I want to touch on. One, my project, I did 5 volt instead of 12 volt. They're both good options. I'm not going to go into all the reasons that I decided to do 5 volt, but do your own research and decide if you want to do 5 volt or 12 volt. Lastly, how much did this all cost? I think all said and done, this project cost me about $650, somewhere in that neighborhood. So pretty affordable for lights that are going to stay on my house all the time. I know that to have a professional company come out and do something similar, it costs about 10 times as much as that. So anyway, if you have the time and energy and want to, you can do this yourself and you can save a ton of money doing it. That's it. If you have any questions, throw them in the comments. And as always, thanks so much for watching. Have a great day.